to real history. Beyond the endless Amazon, a glittering golden treasure beyond imagination was said to wait, and men crossed hell itself to find it. First through hell, the Amazon's true origin story, the dream of gold. The year was 1540, and in Quito, high among the Andes, where the air grew so thin it seemed the world itself was suffocating, Gonzalo Pizarro stood in the sunlight, filtering through carved stone windows, and allowed himself to imagine infinity. His brother Francisco had conquered Peru. Francisco had returned to Spain, laden with gold, enough to make kings envious. Francisco had become legendary before his 40th year, and Gonzalo, the younger brother, had watched from the shadows and felt the ancient sting of being second. But now there was still time. The land to the east, beyond the mountains, remained unmapped. The jungles there harbored secrets. La Canela, the land of cinnamon, where spice-scented trees grew wild and the very air promised wealth. And beyond that, perhaps, the fabled El Dorado itself, the golden city that European merchants whispered about in taverns, the mythical kingdom where gold ran like water and the king himself bathed in precious metals. Gonzalo would find it. Gonzalo would return triumphant. Gonzalo would be remembered not as the younger brother, but as the one who had ventured into the unknown and conquered it. To his side stood Francisco de Orellana, a man with one eye and the bearing of someone who had seen too much of the world to be easily impressed. Orellana had founded the city of Guayaquil. He had fought in Peru's conflicts. He was practical, competent, loyal to the Pizarro family. He was also, Gonzalo sensed, cautious in ways that bordered on cowardice. "We will need soldiers," Gonzalo said, more to himself than to Orellana. "We will need more than soldiers," Orellana replied quietly. "We will need supplies, maps, knowledge of the land." Gonzalo waved his hand dismissively. "The jungle will provide what we need, and what it doesn't provide, we will take." By February of 1541, Gonzalo had assembled his army. 220 Spanish soldiers, their armor glinting in the mountain sun. Behind them came 4,000 indigenous warriors, conscripted from the conquered territories, carrying supplies and weapons they did not understand how to use. There were horses, most of which would be dead within weeks. There was a brigantine ship, dismantled into pieces, ready to be assembled if they found navigable rivers. There were priests blessing the expedition, speaking of divine providence and Christian duty. Orellana watched the assembly with an expression Gonzalo could not quite read. If he felt doubt, he did not voice it. Gonzalo appreciated that. Doubt was contagious, and they had a golden destiny to pursue. As the army began to move, Orellana rode to the front and fell into step beside Gonzalo. The Andes rose around them like the walls of a cathedral, ancient and indifferent to human ambition. "How many," Orellana asked, "do you expect will return?" Gonzalo did not answer immediately. He was thinking of his brother Francisco, who had conquered an empire with a handful of men. Surely Gonzalo could do the same. "All of them," he said finally, "or at least the ones who matter." It was the last time he would believe that. The crossing of the mountains was not a battle against an enemy that could be fought and defeated. It was a battle against a force that cared nothing for human will or ambition. The altitude pressed down on the men like an invisible weight. Horses stumbled and fell, their lungs unable to draw enough oxygen from the thin air. Indigenous warriors, many of them from the lowlands and unaccustomed to such heights, began to die in clusters. Weakness at first, then fever, then silence. By March, Gonzalo's glorious army had become something else, a procession of the damned. Where 4,000 had marched, now only 1,000 remained. The rest had died or deserted, melting back into the mountains like snow under an unexpected sun. Gonzalo did not stop to mourn them. He could not afford to. The dream required movement, momentum, the illusion that they were still conquering something. To stop would be to acknowledge that the mountains had already defeated him. Orellana, following a month behind with a smaller contingent, caught up to the main army in the Zumaco Valley. He arrived with provisions, horses, and news from Guayaquil. More importantly, he arrived with an expression of barely concealed alarm. The losses, he said to Gonzalo, his one good eye studying the exhausted remains of the expedition. "We cannot continue at this rate." "We will continue," Gonzalo replied. "We will continue because the alternative is to admit defeat to a mountain." The jungle, when they finally reached it, seemed at first like salvation. The air grew warmer. The altitude eased, but the jungle brought its own torments. The ground beneath their feet became mud and root and poisoned earth. The canopy overhead blocked the sun. Disease spread through the camp. Fever, dysentery, infections that festered in the warm, wet darkness. The insects were endless, vicious, indifferent to Spanish armor or prayers. They followed rivers downward, hoping to reach navigable water that might carry them toward either the legendary city or at least back to civilization. They built canoes and small boats from jungle timber. They constructed the brigantine ship, piece by careful piece, watching their numbers dwindle with each passing week. By February of 1542, 1 year into their journey, Gonzalo stood on the banks of the Napo River and confronted a truth he had been avoiding. He was lost, his army was starving, and his dream was dying. It was Orellana who suggested it, though Gonzalo would later claim it had been his own decision. "Send a small force downriver," Orellana said as the two men stood watching the Napo's current. The river flowed fast and strong, the sound of it almost hypnotic. "Find food, scout ahead. If the river is navigable, we may find a way through." Gonzalo considered this. His army was skeletal now. Barely 100 Spaniards remained, along with perhaps 1,000 indigenous people, most of them weakened by hunger and disease. The brigantine sat partly completed on the riverbank, a monument to ambitions that were beginning to seem delusional. "How many men?" Gonzalo asked. 50, Orellana said. "You can spare 50 men better than you can spare 500. It was logical. It was also dangerous. Gonzalo recognized the danger, understood that sending Orellana downriver was essentially sending him away. There had been tension between them, unspoken but present. The friction between a man determined to complete an impossible dream and a man trying to keep that dream from becoming a mass grave. "Go," Gonzalo said. "Find what you can find. Return within 3 weeks if possible." Orellana nodded. He did not say what both men were thinking. That 3 weeks was an arbitrary measure of time, meaningless in a jungle where a man could travel for a day and arrive somewhere that felt like another world entirely. Orellana selected his men carefully. He chose soldiers who were strong enough to survive, but not so powerful that Gonzalo would miss them from the main camp. He chose Gaspar de Carvajal, a Dominican friar who had been documenting the expedition since its beginning. A man educated in the ways of letters, someone who might bear witness to whatever they encountered. On an April morning in 1542, Orellana's brigantine and several canoes cast off from the bank. Gonzalo watched them disappear downriver, and in his heart, something shifted. Whether he recognized it then as the moment his expedition ended, history does not record. What is known is that Orellana's group traveled for about 200 leagues, roughly 600 kilometers, and with each passing day, the river's current grew stronger. What had seemed like a temporary scout became a journey of no return. The current was too powerful to fight. To attempt to paddle back upstream would be to invite disaster. Orellana, according to the later accounts, made a decision. They would continue forward. They would follow the river wherever it led. They would find the Atlantic Ocean or die trying, but they would not starve in the jungle while attempting an impossible return. He sent a message back to Gonzalo, if such a message was possible. What it said, exactly, depends on which version of history one consults. Orellana's version: "We cannot return. We continue forward to scout ahead and find passage." Gonzalo's interpretation: "He has abandoned us." The river, indifferent to the interpretations of men, flowed onward, carrying Orellana deeper into territory that no European had ever mapped, into a wilderness so vast that even as it swallowed him, it was offering him something no mountain had offered, no conquest had granted: the chance to be the first. The Amazon River is not like other rivers. It is not a passage through a landscape so much as a landscape itself. Its width alone could swallow a small ocean. Its current is relentless. Its tributaries are so numerous and so massive that explorers have spent lifetimes trying to map them, and parts of it remain unmapped even today. Orellana and his men entered this unknown realm with a brigantine, several canoes, perhaps 50 to 80 men, and very little else beyond the clothes on their backs and the determination that comes from knowing that turning back means death. Gaspar de Carvajal, the friar, began to document what they encountered. His account, which would not be published until 1894, more than 300 years after the journey, is the only detailed written record of the expedition. It is by necessity a work of interpretation. Carvajal was writing what he saw through the lens of his faith, his culture, his terror, and his wonder. The villages they encountered were unlike anything the Spanish had previously seen. They were not the scattered settlements of semi-nomadic peoples. They were permanent cities, some of them substantial enough to suggest a population of thousands. There were roads connecting them, organized agriculture, fortified positions. There was evidence of trade networks, of organized governance, of a civilization that had developed in complete isolation from Europe and had created complexity without conquest. The indigenous people's response to the Spanish arrival was varied. Some villages offered food, turtles, fish, cassava, fruit, and seemed to view the strangers with curiosity rather than hostility. Others attacked, and their attacks were organized and fierce. There were warriors led by a chief named Machiparo who understood clearly what the Spanish represented and resisted with a strategic sophistication that the Europeans had not anticipated. Orellana proved to be a capable commander. He kept his men moving despite their fear and exhaustion. He negotiated when negotiation was possible. He fought when fighting was necessary. He held discipline among soldiers who were, by any objective measure, going mad from fear and uncertainty. But it was the hunger that tested them most profoundly. The jungle, for all its apparent abundance, was not generous with its food. Days would pass with minimal rations. Men grew weak, some grew sick. The river, for all its power and beauty, could not feed them. They depended on what they could find in the villages they passed, and not all villages were willing to trade. Then came June of 1542, and the encounter that would define the river forever in European imagination. In what historians believe was the Namunda region, Orellana's group encountered a large village. The Spanish approached with the usual mixture of curiosity and caution, hoping for provisions. What happened next, according to Carvajal's account, was an attack led partly by warriors whom he identified as women. The details are sparse and hotly debated by modern historians. Were the fighters all women? Were they women fighting alongside men? Did Carvajal misidentify what he was seeing? Did he exaggerate to make the story more dramatic? The truth is that indigenous Amazonian cultures did include women in warfare. It is also true that Spanish soldiers, primarily men raised in a culture where women did not fight, might have misidentified or exaggerated what they witnessed. What is not debated is that there was a fierce battle, that the Spanish were shocked, and that Orellana, ever the pragmatist, ever the man trying to make sense of the impossible, decided to give these warriors a name that would echo through history. Amazons, he called them, invoking the legendary warrior women of Greek mythology. Carvajal wrote it down. Orellana repeated it. The name took hold, spreading through the Spanish colonies, then through Europe, and finally into history books, where it remained even as historians grew more skeptical of its accuracy. But in the moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Orellana's men defeated the warriors, whether female, male, or both. What mattered was that they captured supplies. What mattered was that they survived another day on a river that seemed determined to either kill them or transform them into something the world had never seen before. The months of travel became a blur of encounters, villages peaceful and hostile, rivers, tributaries feeding into the main channel like blood into a heart, the jungle growing denser, the sense of isolation growing more profound. Men died, from wounds, from sickness, from the simple accumulated weight of despair. And yet Orellana pushed forward. Carvajal continued to write, recording observations about the peoples they encountered, the animals they saw, the plants, the geography. He was trying to create a record of the impossible, to make concrete something that felt more like a dream than reality. By August of 1542, after approximately 8 months of river travel, the water began to change. The current that had been so relentless, that had carried them forward with such force, began to widen and calm. The color of the water shifted. The air smelled different. Then one day they saw it. The ocean. The Atlantic Ocean was not the destination Orellana had set out to find, but it was, in its way, proof of something miraculous. He and his men had crossed, no, not crossed, but followed, the longest river in the world. They had traveled approximately 4,700 kilometers through territory that no European had ever navigated. They had encountered indigenous peoples, survived attacks, endured starvation, and emerged alive on the other side. It was August 24th, 1542, and Francisco de Orellana had become the first European to traverse the Amazon River from its mountain origins to its mouth at the Atlantic. The journey from Napo to Ocean had taken approximately 8 months. The journey from Quito to that same point had taken a year and a half. And the entire time Gonzalo Pizarro had been waiting in the jungle, growing increasingly convinced that his lieutenant and friend had abandoned him deliberately. Orellana's men, what remained of them, reached the island of Cubagua near the Venezuelan coast. They were skeletal, exhausted, their clothes in tatters, their skin burned by sun and marked by insect bites that had become infected. They looked less like conquering conquistadors and more like ghosts that had learned through experience how to survive. Yet Orellana understood even then that he had accomplished something that would change how the world understood geography. The river that would bear the name Amazon, given by Europeans who confused the indigenous warriors with Greek mythology, was vast beyond imagining. The peoples who lived on its banks had created civilizations that rivaled in complexity anything Europe had built, and all of it had been documented by a friar who was writing furiously in a journal that would not be read by the world for centuries. But Orellana also understood something else, something that weighed on him more heavily than his exhaustion. Gonzalo Pizarro was not here to congratulate him. When Orellana returned to Peru, the reception was not the one he had imagined. Gonzalo had emerged from the jungle months earlier, broken by hunger and rage. He had lost 3,000 men, perhaps more, to the mountains, the jungle, and disease. He had found no cinnamon. He had found no gold. And he had found that his closest lieutenant, the man he had trusted to find salvation by being sent downriver, had instead vanished into a river that seemed to swallow men whole. In Gonzalo's mind, and in the minds of those who supported him, Orellana's disappearance constituted an act of betrayal. How was one to interpret it otherwise? Sent to scout and return with provisions, Orellana had instead disappeared for months and emerged claiming he had navigated an entire unknown river. It was, to Gonzalo's supporters, the story of a man who had calculated the moment when the expedition was effectively over and had abandoned it to pursue his own glory. The political atmosphere in Peru was volatile. Gonzalo had the ear of powerful men. Orellana, for all his achievements, was returning with an exhausted crew and a story so fantastic that it bordered on the incredible. "Did you attempt to return?" Gonzalo demanded when they met. "The river's current was too strong," Orellana replied. "After 200 leagues, it became impossible." "Convenient," Gonzalo said, his voice sharp as obsidian. "You were sent to scout. You were sent to find food and return. Instead, you sailed away into the jungle and left me and 4,000 men to starve." The words hung in the air between them, and something that had been living in the space between two old friends died. They would never be reconciled. Orellana sought recognition from the Spanish crown for his achievement. He requested a governorship of the lands he had discovered. He wanted to organize a second expedition, better equipped, to return to the Amazon and establish a more thorough exploration. The crown, cautious due to Portuguese claims on some of the territory, was sympathetic but not generous. Some support was granted but not enough. And Gonzalo, who had significant influence in Peru, ensured that Orellana's reputation was undermined at every turn. In 1545, Orellana managed to outfit a second expedition. He gathered ships, provisions, and men, willing to return to the river that had become his obsession. But the voyage was ill-fated from the beginning. Ships were lost to storms, crew members died of disease, and in November of 1546, near the mouth of the river he had discovered, Orellana's vessel capsized. Francisco de Orellana, age approximately 35, drowned in the waters of the Amazon, the river that would carry his name forward into history, even as it swallowed him into darkness. He would not return to Spain. He would not write a detailed account of his journey. He would not establish a colony or a settlement. He would not see vindication or recognition. He would simply disappear into the river, joining thousands of others whose names have been lost to time. 350 years later, in 1894, a Spanish historian named José Toribio Medina discovered Gaspar de Carvajal's journal. The friar's meticulous account of the Amazon expedition, preserved through centuries of war, revolution, and forgetting. When it was published, the world finally had, in the friar's own words, a detailed record of what Orellana's expedition had encountered. Archaeological surveys suggested that millions of people had lived in the Amazon before European contact, building civilizations of considerable complexity. What emerged slowly through scholarship and science was a more complicated picture than simple conquest. Orellana had not discovered a wilderness inhabited by simple savages. He had encountered ancient societies that had adapted to one of the world's most challenging environments and created organized agricultural, trading civilizations. The rivers he had sailed were not empty waterways, but the arteries of an interconnected world. And that world was devastated, within decades of contact, by European disease. Smallpox, influenza, and other pathogens killed perhaps 90% of the indigenous population, not through violence, but through the simple accident of biological incompatibility. By the time large-scale European colonization of the Amazon began, the civilizations Carvajal had documented were already in catastrophic decline. Gonzalo Pizarro's expedition, despite its failure to find gold or cinnamon, and Francisco de Orellana's solo voyage had inadvertently mapped a river and documented a world that would be destroyed before it could even be truly known. If you enjoyed today's return to the Middle Ages, I'd be truly grateful for your like. It's the best way to let me know that these stories are worth making. I'm already preparing the next chapter for you, so if you don't want to miss it, consider subscribing. I'll see you next week.